I first read Going to Tehran years ago, not long after it came out in 2013, probably a few months after publication. At the time, it felt like one of those books reformists or foreign policy realists might appreciate, while others would strongly reject. It read almost like a geopolitical thought experiment, in some ways disappointing, in other ways deeply interesting, especially because it came from former CIA and National Security Council officials. Back then, I agreed with some of the author's arguments, disagreed with others, then eventually put the book on a shelf and moved on. But a few months ago, with another war expanding across the Middle East, tensions rising again in the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices surging, and serious discussions emerging about the decline of the petrodollar system and the rise of alternative financial blocs, I decided to reread it. I even assigned it to my students, many of whom constantly ask profound questions about Iran, its geopolitical position, and how all of this shapes U.S. foreign policy and international relations. And honestly, rereading Going to Tehran now, especially in light of the U.S. war on Iran, was unsettling. Not because the authors were right about everything, they were not, but because they predicted far more of the current trajectory than I expected. The book no longer felt like a controversial argument. It felt like a warning that many of us, including policymakers in Washington, chose to ignore. What struck me most this time was not the specifics of every prediction, but the broader insight underneath the book. The authors understood something about American power that Washington still struggles to confront. Military dominance cannot indefinitely substitute for geopolitical realism, and this argument did not come from fringe activists or ideological outsiders. Flynt, Leverett, and Hillary Mann. Leverett worked inside the machinery of American foreign policy itself, before resigning during the Bush years because they believed the United States was heading toward strategic disaster in West Asia, the region more commonly called the Middle East. The core argument of Going to Tehran was actually very simple. The United States needed to come to terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran, not because Iran was democratic, not because it respected human rights, not because the authors admired the regime, but because every attempt to isolate, threaten, sanction, suffocate, or intimidate Iran had failed, and worse than failed, it had strengthened the very factions inside Iran that Washington claimed it wanted to weaken. The Leveretts wrote something in 2013 that sounds chilling today. They warned that Washington's Iran policy is locked in a trajectory that will ultimately lead to war. At the time, many dismissed that statement as alarmist. Today, it sounds less like analysis and more like prophecy. And what makes the book especially relevant now is that the authors understood early on that the conflict with Iran was never only about Iran. It was also about the future of American hegemony itself. For decades, the United States approached the Middle East not simply as a region to stabilize, but as one to dominate strategically, militarily, and financially. The petrodollar system, where global oil trade flows through the US dollar and recycles into American financial markets, became one of the pillars of post-Cold War American power. But history has a way of punishing overreach. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan drained American credibility and resources. Endless sanctions transformed the dollar from a global medium of commerce into an instrument of coercion. Countries that once feared challenging Washington slowly began building alternatives. And ironically, Iran became one of the catalysts accelerating that shift. China and Iran increasingly moved toward non-dollar trade arrangements. Russia and Iran deepened military and economic coordination. BRICS countries openly began discussing alternatives to dollar dependency. The more sanctions Washington imposed, the greater the incentive became for rival powers to build systems outside American control. So we arrive at a paradox the Leveretts understood years ago. A strategy designed to preserve American dominance may actually be helping erode the financial and geopolitical foundations of that dominance. And this is where comparisons to Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan become unavoidable. Again and again, American foreign policy operates on the belief that overwhelming military and economic pressure can force societies to bend indefinitely to Washington's strategic vision. Vietnam should have taught the United States that nationalism and historical memory are stronger than occupation. Iraq should have taught us that ideological foreign policy detached from local realities produces catastrophe. Afghanistan should have demonstrated the limits of military supremacy in a society unwilling to submit to foreign control. Yet despite all of those lessons, U.S. policy toward Iran continued operating through sanctions, coercion, isolation, and threats of regime change, and the assumption that the Islamic Republic would eventually collapse under pressure. Instead, the Islamic Republic adapted. It survived. And in surviving, it became more militarized, more securitized, and more committed to regional deterrence. This is one of the hardest but most important arguments in going to Tehran. Iran does not behave irrationally. It behaves like a state trying to survive in what it perceives as a permanently hostile environment. And whether people like that argument or not, we at least have to understand the logic from Tehran's perspective. The United States invaded Afghanistan on one side of Iran and Iraq on the other. American officials openly discussed regime change. Israeli leaders repeatedly threatened military strikes. Sanctions targeted nearly every sector of the Iranian economy. Under those conditions, should anyone really be surprised that Iran pursued asymmetric military capabilities, regional alliances, and strategic depth across Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen? Now, none of this requires defending the Islamic Republic, and this is where I partially disagree with the Leveretts. At times, they are too dismissive of the regime's internal brutality. Iran has imprisoned dissidents, censored journalists, violently crushed protests, restricted women's freedoms, and committed serious human rights abuses. Those realities cannot be ignored. But at the same time, we also have to confront another uncomfortable question. Did decades of sanctions, sabotage, isolation, and permanent external threats strengthen the most authoritarian tendencies inside Iran? I think the answer is yes. History repeatedly shows that societies under siege rarely become more liberal. They become more paranoid, militarized, and securitized. Hardliners gain power because they can always point to outside enemies. And unintentionally, the United States gave Iranian hardliners exactly the narrative they needed. Every new sanction, every threat of military action, every public discussion of regime change reinforced the argument that Iran was under existential assault. The state could then frame dissent not merely as domestic opposition, but as vulnerability to foreign subversion. In that environment, security institutions inevitably become more powerful. And I think one of the most important questions this book forces us to ask is this. What might Iran look like today had it been integrated into the global economy decades ago instead of isolated from it? Economic openness does not automatically create democracy, but prolonged siege conditions almost certainly discourage it. If the United States had pursued normalization and economic integration after the Cold War rather than permanent hostility, Iran's middle class might have become stronger. Civil society might have expanded further. Reformist movements might have had more leverage. Younger generations might have inherited a country less dominated by revolutionary paranoia and security politics. Instead, sanctions hollowed out economic opportunity while strengthening black markets, corruption networks, and security elites. In many ways, the Islamic Republic learned resilience precisely because it was forced to survive under pressure. Another major insight from the book is that isolating Iran never meant Iran would remain isolated forever. The Leveretts warned that pushing Tehran out of the Western order would simply drive it toward China and Russia. And that is exactly what happened. China stepped into spaces the United States abandoned. Russia and Iran deepened cooperation. Regional powers increasingly began balancing between Washington and Beijing rather than automatically aligning with the United States. The irony is extraordinary, and it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. A strategy designed to weaken Iran may ultimately have accelerated the emergence of a more multipolar world, less dependent on American power. And rereading the book now, I keep returning to one central theme. American foreign policy often confuses dominance with leadership. Dominance relies on fear. Leadership relies on legitimacy. Empires often assume having many enemies demonstrates strength, when in reality it can demonstrate an inability to build durable relationships. To me, this is one of the deepest lessons of the book. The United States would probably be more secure today had it spent the last 40 years building sustainable relations across the Middle East, rather than relying so heavily on sanctions, military interventions, proxy conflicts, and regime change fantasies. Making friends with the world is ultimately wiser, cheaper, and more sustainable than endlessly manufacturing enemies. And one of the strongest aspects of going to Tehran is that it frames diplomacy not as weakness, but as strategic maturity. The authors invoke Nixon opening relations with China. The United States did not normalize ties with Beijing because China suddenly became liberal or democratic. It did so because leaders recognized geopolitical reality. But with Iran, American policy often treated negotiation itself as surrender, and that refusal to engage seriously may prove historically disastrous. There is another line from the book that stayed with me after rereading it. The authors argue that the United States must either come to terms with the Islamic Republic of Iran or face the consequences of its own self-destructive mythology. I think we are beginning to live inside those consequences now. To be clear, none of this means the Iranian government is innocent. It is not. But it is possible to oppose authoritarianism inside Iran while also recognizing that American strategy toward Iran has often been deeply counterproductive. It is possible to condemn repression while admitting sanctions have not liberated ordinary Iranians. It is possible to criticize Tehran while acknowledging Washington repeatedly ignored opportunities for diplomacy. And that complexity is exactly what makes this book uncomfortable for many people. It refuses the simplicity of good versus evil. Instead, it forces readers to confront the possibility that American power itself, not just Iranian behavior, helped produce the current crisis. And perhaps that is the book's most important contribution. At this point in history, after Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and now another widening confrontation involving Iran, the real question is no longer whether the United States still possesses enormous military power. Of course it does, and that power remains undeniable. The real question is whether America can finally learn the limits of power itself. Can it recognize that sanctions cannot indefinitely substitute for diplomacy? That military supremacy does not guarantee political legitimacy, that a stable world order cannot be maintained forever through coercion alone. Rereading Going to Tehran years later, I still do not agree with every argument the authors make, but I now believe they saw something many policymakers refused to see. Endless confrontation with Iran was never going to produce peace, stability, or democratic transformation. And great powers often decline not simply because rivals grow stronger, but because arrogance blinds them to changing realities. I put this book on a shelf more than a decade ago. I genuinely wish I had taken it more seriously, because today, with the world drifting toward fragmentation, the global financial system under strain, and the old certainties of American hegemony fading, Going to Tehran no longer feels like a controversial book. It feels like a warning we failed to hear. And as brutal and repressive as the Islamic Republic has been, honesty also requires acknowledging that Iran's modern trajectory did not emerge in a vacuum. It was deeply shaped by outside interference, especially by Western powers. After decades of witnessing bloodshed, instability, and the destruction of countless young lives, I have increasingly come to believe that the roots of Iran's tragedy go back at least a century, especially to 1953, when the CIA overthrew the most democratic government Iran had experienced under Dr. Mossadegh. That coup did not simply remove a prime minister, it shattered faith in democracy itself. It convinced generations of Iranians that foreign powers would never allow genuine self-determination when economic and geopolitical interests were involved. And I also do not believe the Shah was overthrown purely by the people alone. Western powers and oil interests again played major roles in shaping Iran's fate. History is far more complicated than the simplistic narratives repeated by both monarchists and revolutionaries. I still remember the Shah's televised speech when he declared, I have heard your cry of revolution. That moment mattered historically because compromise, reform, and political transition were still possible. But after decades of foreign interference, political repression, manipulation, and revolutionary indoctrination, Iranian society lacked the political maturity and strategic understanding necessary to navigate that moment carefully. Most people did not fully understand how global powers operate, how foreign policy manipulates domestic unrest, or how revolutionary movements can quickly be hijacked by more organized and ruthless factions. Instead of negotiating reforms, constitutional freedoms, and gradual democratic transition, the country followed the old revolutionary model romanticized throughout the 19th and 20th centuries: total regime overthrow at any cost. And the result was not freedom. It was another cycle of authoritarianism, trauma, and destruction. And honestly, I fear we may once again be standing at a very similar crossroads today. Many of the human rights abuses committed by the current regime might also have been mitigated, or perhaps even avoided, if the United States had not approached post-revolutionary Iran with immediate hostility, sanctions, isolation, and permanent confrontation from the very beginning in 1979. People may disagree with me on this, but I genuinely believe Iran should have been integrated into the international community decades ago rather than pushed into permanent isolation. Because had Iran been economically and diplomatically integrated into the world, we might not still be witnessing the same repression, paranoia, brutality, and human rights abuses nearly half a century later. It is impossible to ignore the role that U.S. interventionism, Western foreign policy, and at times a broader colonial mindset have played in demonizing countries like Iran, while simultaneously empowering hardliners within those societies. Isolation strengthens extremist factions because governments can justify repression through the language of national security and foreign threats. And the Islamic Republic has used that logic for decades to consolidate internal control. Take China as an example. 30 years ago, China was widely associated with severe human rights abuses, political repression, and mass executions. Yet today, China presents itself as a global economic power and even a diplomatic mediator. None of that transformation would have happened if China had remained permanently sanctioned and isolated from the global system. Economic integration created incentives for stability, legitimacy, and at least some responsiveness to global opinion. Iran, by contrast, remained isolated, and isolation breeds unaccountability. When countries become disconnected from the global system, leadership becomes less responsive to outside scrutiny and more dependent on internal coercion. We saw a glimpse of this a few years ago when international pressure and solidarity with Iranian dissidents forced the government to release some prisoners. That proved outside pressure can occasionally produce limited results. But even then, the regime still retained the power to execute people under accusations like treason or threats against national security. So the deeper structure of repression remained intact, and meaningful progress still feels painfully distant. And finally, I think part of this conversation also needs to be directed toward the Iranian diaspora itself. I want to be clear. I do not know whether your loyalties lie primarily with Israel, with the Pahlavi, or whether your own trauma has pushed you towards supporting revenge and violent regime overthrow. I cannot judge anyone's personal experiences, but I believe in a democratic America, not an imperial America that dominates, punishes, and bullies other nations into submission. Holding any of the European countries' citizenship or the U.S. passport should not become a transaction that obligates silence about the destructive consequences of interventionism and hegemony around the world. True loyalty to democratic values requires the courage to criticize injustice even when it comes from one's own side. And personally, I no longer believe revenge heals nations. After everything Iranians have endured, I do not believe endless revenge leads toward peace or dignity. If Iranians can someday live stable, peaceful, dignified, and prosperous lives, even gradually and imperfectly under the current system, that matters more to me than fantasies of violent overthrow and national collapse. I do not want another Syria, another Libya, another Iraq, another lost generation sacrificed in the name of geopolitical agendas and power struggles. And who knows, maybe one day Iran, the United States, and even Israel could become genuine partners built on diplomacy, mutual respect, and cooperation rather than endless hostility. History changes constantly. Former enemies have become allies before, but that future will never emerge through humiliation, sanctions, dehumanization, revenge, or perpetual war rhetoric. What I do not want is to keep watching generation after generation of Iranians lose their futures, their humanity, and their lives while global powers pursue strategic interests. The people of Iran deserve peace more than they deserve to become pawns in another historical confrontation between empires and ideologies.